very good evening. I'm Dati Lamba coming to you from a remote location in New York City. Welcome to the Tuesday night edition of South Asian News with Vision of Asia. Truly a sad time in America. Tonight's episode covers much on the untimely death of George Floyd, which has shaken the country with an outpour of frustrations and demonstrations, both peaceful and in the form of riots and looting. This is the 8th day of nationwide protests for justice for George Floyd and the movement Black Lives Matter. And at this moment of our program, New York City, where we are coming from, has now implemented a curfew starting right now at 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. This curfew will remain in for the rest of the week. Today, former Vice President Joe Biden delivered remarks in Philadelphia on the civil unrest occurring across the nation and called for Congress to act this month itself on measures on real police reform. If you are protesting, we urge you to participate in peaceful demonstrations and wear masks and practice social distancing, and note that we're still in a pandemic. Take all necessary precautions and follow your state's guidelines on coronavirus and its updates. If you would like to share your opinion, your voice on this issue, please reach us on events@itvgold.com. Time to now begin tonight's episode featuring South Asian Americans on George Floyd and the concept of systemic racism. Here are the headlines. Candlelight Vigil for George Floyd gathers hundreds of New Yorkers, Astoria Park, New York City. Assemblyman Mukerji on justice for George Floyd and South Asian voices, 33rd Legislative District in New Jersey. Senator Gopal addresses South Asian American communities, systemic racism and nationwide protests, 11th Legislative District, New Jersey. Veteran journalist Rohit Vyas discusses George Floyd and internalized racism in America, New Jersey. It's time for a short break on Vision of Asia, Voice of the Community. Come right back to us. Welcome back. I'm Aditi Lamba and this is Vision of Asia. In tonight's episode, we are talking about the untimely and sad death of George Floyd, an unarmed African-American man who died at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis. Since then, demonstrations have filled streets across the United States to stand against the injustice and to protect against police brutality in the country. Here are some highlights now from a candlelight vigil which was held by the community at Astoria Park in Queens, New York. This vigil was a peaceful demonstration which saw hundreds come together in solidarity, shedding light on all the lives that have been lost. Earlier today, we spoke with New Jersey State Senator Gopal, who provided us with much information on these nationwide protests, saying that he agrees and supports peaceful demonstrations advocating for voice of people of color and all that are suppressed by the system. He called for institutional changes and for the South Asian community to partake in a conversation on systemic racism and its impact on Black and Brown communities. At a time where we are in this pandemic, minority communities are disproportionately affected, Senator Gopal spoke on standing in solidarity with communities that are hurt and shared resources from his office. Here is Senator Gopal.
In terms of discussing systemic racism and police brutality, this is something that's come up in the last 7 days. We're looking at the 7th day of protest today. New York City, where we're coming from, has had some riots happen here. How do you address this issue that has, left the communities distraught and so sad and upset? And, how do we react and act accordingly right now?
I think we have to react with voting is the most important thing. I think to vote in elected officials whose policies are going to reflect some of these changes. Yesterday in my district in the city of Asbury Park, we had about 2,000 people. People are out there. Obviously, there's a lot of people who don't want to go right now, but support it because of COVID-19 and they might be older or have some underlying health conditions or things like that. So, we've been telling them, stay home, but put up a post on social media, be supportive. But I think these are important conversations to have. There was a wonderful moment down in the city of Camden, which has one of the highest crime rates across the country in the United States, where the police chief and the police department marched with the protesters, stood with the protesters. That's what we need to see more of. We need to see more of that police-community relationship building.
How important is right now for these demonstrations to be peaceful? As a senator, I know you might be concerned about it. Luckily, in New Jersey, most of the demonstrations have been peaceful, but New York is about to go into a curfew which starts at 8 p.m. today. how, are you addressing protesters? And what do you have to say to these people that are looting and that are rioting?
Yeah, I saw a statement from the ACLU. I don't know how effective these curfews are. Sometimes the curfews may make things worse. I get the balance is that you don't want people out at midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. looting or doing anything. But at the same time, to tell a protester, hey, you have to stop at 8 o'clock, they have emotions, they have feelings, they need to be able to speak, and they need to be able to stand there. So I don't necessarily think I agree with these curfews, but at the same time, they got to be peaceful. I was on the phone with a police officer who went to the emergency room last night in Asbury Park and got a huge rock thrown at him. I mean, he's 22 years old and a brand new officer. So I think there has to be peaceful. We can't be destroying businesses. It's not getting anyone's attention. It's only going to turn people away. What we need to do is we need to vote. We need to make sure our voices are heard. We need to make sure petitions are filled, and we need to get rid of elected officials that are doing ourselves a great deal of disservice. I mean, I watch what the U.S. president is doing, and it's absolutely awful. The message he sends goes against everything as far as what a democratic society should be doing. And there's a big election in November, and I hope voters are going to vote him out. But this is the opportunity for everybody to kind of speak out, and certainly violence is not the answer.
There are so many families that are grieving the death of George Floyd because this reminds them of the grievings that they have had to go through. We're talking about hundreds of African American families that have faced systemic racism, police brutality. My question to you would be, as a senator, what can you really do in terms of making an institutionalizing change? How do you really change the institution that is currently permitting this racist, display out and out?
One thing, we can't let cover-ups happen. We have to make sure that good police officers are rewarded for speaking out. And those that, we have tens of thousands of police officers that do an honorable, great job, but they all have to collectively speak out when they see something wrong happening. And just watching that video of George Floyd was heartbreaking and brought tears to my eyes just to see someone cry out in pain and good people standing around that generally didn't do the right thing when they watched their fellow officer, and they all should be charged and all should go to jail. But that's not what good people do. So we need all police officers to speak out. We need more police relationship building with the residents. I want to see police officers out there with residents, not behind desks, in schools, and actually building relationships and having that back and forth. Used to be at a time when a lot of our members in the community would know each other. That's not the case anymore.
Right. According to you, what is going to happen in the next few days? The protests are continuing to happen. Curfews are being placed in so many parts of the country. What are we looking at here? The South Asian community is very worried and scared in both New Jersey and New York here. So I would like for you to address that.
Okay, we have to just continue to promote for peaceful protests. In Asbury Park, in my district yesterday, talking to the city, roughly 70 to 80% of the people that were marching there were not from the city. They had never seen them before. So I think we have to be careful about folks that are coming from the outside. I had seen some reports of some right-wing groups that were coming to kind of cause and stir trouble. We have to be cautious of all of these things, and South Asians, especially for those that own retail and small businesses, just to make sure you're in touch with your local police department, make sure that you have everything locked up, and we have to get through these days. At the same time, being cautious and careful and not tell people not to protest. That's not the message. People should protest. So hopefully socially distant and 6 feet and wearing masks, because we still have a pandemic at the same time. But they need to do these things all at the same time as being as peaceful as possible, listening to the line of Dr. Martin Luther King and other great African American leaders who preached and made incredible differences in their community.
It's time for a short break on Vision of Asia, Voice of the Community. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back. This is Vision of Asia, Voice of the Community, and I am Aditi Lamba. Continuing our report tonight on the outrage in the nation in response to George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, we have now a segment of our conversation with veteran journalist and political commentator Rohit Vyas. Speaking to us on internalized racism and the message of death of George Floyd, Rohit Vyas urged audience to educate themselves and be an ally of the African American community, saying that minority voices are represented in unity and solidarity. Here is Rohit Vyas, who also shares some instances of racism that he also faced as a journalist.
I wish I was talking to you in better circumstances right now, but the nation is currently raging out in protests and riots all across the 50 states, and we've seen a lot of destruction, a lot of voicing, and a lot of grieving that's also taken place. My first question to you has to be, when we are trying to explain this to our community members or our children or our youth, how should we address the situation right now? And what kind of information do they need to know about what happened to George Floyd that is so relevant?
First of all, I'm not surprised by what happened. It's been a long time. This has been going on for the African American community. They've been suffering for centuries and decades. They've been fighting for their rights, and by extension, fighting for the rights of everybody who's in a minority, including and especially the South Asian American, Indian American community. I think Indian Americans, South Asian Americans should look at this very carefully and rise up and support the African American community, who are really, as you put it, hurting right now. They're hurting very badly. They have faced this systemic racism for a long time, for generations, injustice, and if it weren't for the struggles of the African American community, listen to this very carefully,
Right.
If it was not for the struggles of the African American community, all minorities, that includes the South Asian community, our community, the Latino community, Asians as a whole, nobody would be able to get opportunities in this country. It's all because of the struggles of the African American community trying to get to an equal plane. So this is a very sad development. At the same time, it's been a long time coming. I'm surprised that this kind of an uprising hasn't been louder for much sooner. It should have taken place a long time ago, because the systemic racism, the systemic injustices against people of color have been going on for far too long. It needs to stop now.
For our community members, let's have a little discussion on systemic racism and internalized racism. What can you tell us in terms of educating our own folks into what has happened and why the outrage is so massive? And also, this conversation about systemic racism has been happening for so many years now. What do we do at this point?
First of all, we should come out and support the African American community completely without any reservations. We should be out there in droves. We should be out there to support them. This could affect, this will and can affect and has affected our community and affected many of them for a long time as well. Don't forget, I just wanted to bring this example and remind everybody that just in the year 2015, there was an Indian who was visiting his son and grandkid from India, Suresh Bhai Patel, in Madison, Alabama. And all he was doing was taking a walk around the neighborhood, his son's neighborhood, and someone, apparently a white person, not apparently, reportedly, a white person called the police to say that there's this black person snooping around looking at houses and garages and the like. White police officers showed up. They looked at him, asked him what he was doing there. He didn't understand them. He spoke Gujarati. And instead of trying to figure out who he was, etc., you can see it all on the police dash cam. They just picked him up, slammed him to the ground, and left him paralyzed for life. Eventually, no justice was served, even after the federal government brought charges, and the charges were dropped against the white police officer. Our community has been complacent for far too long, Aditi. Our community has, because they've been touted as the community in the higher educated percentile, in the higher income percentile, therefore the privileged community, they think they're immune to this, and this can never happen to them. I have a lot of stories to tell. So we probably have to do it another time, but I have a lot of stories to tell. I have personally witnessed the attacks on our own community back in the 1970s. I was the only journalist covering the Indian community back then in the 1970s. I remember the Hindu temple in Flushing, Queens. It was a brand new Hindu temple at that time, just been built. A lot of pride for the few Hindus that were around in Flushing. I remember the white mobs that used to come and attack the Indian community. They're the small Indian community. They would rip off the saris of Indian women on the streets. They'd call them dot heads. They spray painted graffiti on the Hindu temple. Police didn't do anything to protect them at the time. And I remember as a young journalist, the Indian community were looking to talk to somebody. I was the only reporter around, and therefore they looked to me sort of like a leader, which I wasn't, because our Indian community groups were fledgling. They were brand new and had not ever organized for something. There were just a handful of people that were in any one or two of the groups that existed at the time. And the community reached out to me by telephone and said, you got to do something and help us. And I remember, I was just about 19 or 20 and, reporter and editing a newspaper and all the rest of it. And I went to the precinct, the 109th Police Precinct in Flushing, Queens. And I asked to see the police commander. And they said, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm a member of the Indian American community. I'm a reporter, and my community is being harassed by white mobs, and we need justice. We need police protection. I'd like to speak to the commander. So they didn't even believe I was Indian. They said, you look too white to be Indian. I said, well, that's going to be a long story to explain. But no, I'm Indian, and I'm here to fight for my community. They threatened me with arrest if I didn't leave. I said, all I want to do is meet with your commander and ask for protection for my community. They are frightened out there. They declined, and they said, if you don't get out of here, we're going to arrest you. I had a bit of an argument. I almost got arrested. And just as I was about to think of what should I do, should I leave? Should I let them arrest me? Out comes this gentleman in a white shirt, obviously a senior officer. These two saluted him. And he came out to me, asked me my name. And I told him who I was. And he said, young man, I'm impressed with you. Come on in, let's have a chat. I was lucky.
Right.
He got me in. I was the commander of the precinct. William Pirro was his name at the time, I recall. He invited me in, talked to me. He said, what's the problem? He asked me, and I told him my community's suffering. Nobody's there to protect them. Your officers are doing nothing. You got to do something. Luckily, fortunately, after I spoke to him and established a rapport, they brought in police protection for the Hindu temple. Now, this is a true story. This is my own narrative of what happened. But there were many, many, many such instances throughout, and they continue to this day. So our community really has to wake up, and all communities have to wake up, including the majority white community. There are the underprivileged among them who need to wake up, and they are waking up. They know that they too will suffer. It's going to evolve into this thing of the rich versus the poor. I see what's going to happen. I can just see it from the experience I've had over more than 4 decades in journalism, that this is going to not stop here. It'll get worse. It'll become a matter of a struggle between the privileged and the underprivileged. And it's about time we all stood together in sympathy and caring for one another as human beings.
Currently, cities across the nation are extended curfews into Sunday night in an attempt to tamp down the violence and vandalism, as outrage for justice for Floyd has seen thousands march and protest all across the nation. This is more than 100 cities in the United States, with each day filled with protesters that are asking why an unarmed black man, George Floyd, had to die for the color of his skin. What does this mean for other communities of color, such as the South Asian American community? We recently spoke with Assemblyman Raj Mukerji, who spoke on the role and responsibility of our community in voicing for justice lawfully right now, saying that his office is there for all the need and help or assistance. Assemblyman Mukerji also highlighted the importance of exercising the right to vote so that our voice is heard and counted for. Here is Assemblyman Raj Mukerji.
20 states have a curfew going on right now due to these demonstrations that have gone really violent. You have, the president also saying that he's going to deploy the National Guard. My question to you is, as a father and as a South Asian, how do we address this to our kids? And also, how do we address it to the youth that is, living in this country and they're growing up here and they are, the minority community? How do we, have this conversation right now?
Yeah. So, as South Asian Americans, I think we can always draw inspiration from Mahatma Gandhi and from Dr. King. And on the one hand, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it's an adage that we must instill in our children. And we also have to ensure that they understand that peaceful civil protest is the way in which we will eventually achieve these ends. What's happening, what we're seeing in terms of the violence and the looting, that is not widespread. These are fringe elements. And this is a discrete minority of folks, and they're not protesters, right? These are opportunists. These are folks that would be committed to violence anyway. Robbing stores is doing nothing for Mr. Floyd's memory. So these are fringe elements. They're trying to distract from the issues that are actually at hand, that the vast majority of protesters are committed to seeing through in a peaceful act of protest. And I think President Obama and First Lady Obama have spoken very eloquently about that topic. And I think we just have to keep our eye on the prize and not be distracted by fringe elements that are committing criminal acts, because they're not the real protesters and they don't represent the vast majority of protesters.
Right. And this entire process has definitely bring up, the conversation of systemic racism, which exists in the nation, and, its interaction with police brutality, another topic that we all talk about. My question to you is, as somebody who works on legislation a lot, what is needed out of the law right now in order to get some peace, in order to get some answers to what is happening and how can we really combat it? Right now we're talking about these protests. My question to you is, what after these protests? What do we really need in our system?
I don't think legislation is going to be enough. That doesn't mean that policies that ensure blacks and browns are locked up disproportionately for offenses that are committed at a similar rate by their white counterparts should be the order of the day. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at our criminal justice system to ensure that any imbalance is corrected. That doesn't mean that the laws and the policies that promote systemic racism or that we can't deal with and escalate the gradation of how we treat bias crimes in different states, which we've done, I think, a good job of in New Jersey.
Right.
All that's true. But we're not going to be able to legislate away hate. We're not going to be able to legislate away racism. We're not going to be able to legislate what's in people's hearts. What's in people's hearts, what's in people's minds. The idea that we have taken racism, discrimination, biases, prejudices that were previously, I think, really thought of as being on the fringe,
Right.
made it more okay to be in the mainstream and to talk openly on social media or otherwise about these horrific views that people have. This hatred coming out into the open, that is very distressing. And there's a lot of damage that I think we need to repair in our country. There's polarization. We see that in our politics. We see that at our dinner tables. And I think that that can't be legislated away. For us to heal as a nation, we're going to have to understand each other's perspectives. We're going to have to understand the experience of young Black Americans growing up in this country. And we're going to have to, I think, to heal as a nation, we're really going to have to look at the soul of our country and think about what it means. Think about the responsibility that all of us have in shaping our future. It's a very difficult time.
Yeah.
And that is all for tonight's episode. Remember to send us your suggestions and get your voices and organizations on our show. Email us on events@itvgold.com or follow us on Facebook at itvgold. You can also now subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch many of our popular shows for free. Thank you for joining us tonight from a remote location in New York City. This is Vision of Asia, and I am Diti Lamba. Take care and please stay well.